All right, welcome everyone. On behalf of George Mason University's Center for Resilient and Sustainable Communities, I want to welcome you to the second in our series of TIDES Fireside Chats. This week, we are featuring Mei Lin Fung, who is a co-founder and chair of the PeopleCentered Internet. And welcome, Mei Lin. Before we get started, I'll just tell you briefly, my name is Catherine Lasky, and I'm director of the Center for Resilient and Sustainable Communities, or C-RASC. At C-RASC, we focus on working in partnership with communities to develop initiatives to enhance resilience to today's multiplying and accelerating stresses. So one of our primary activities is TIDES, and this is a TIDES Fireside Chat. TIDES stands for Sharing to Accelerate Research, Transformative Innovation for Development and Emergency Support. That's a mouthful. I had to write it down to remember it. TIDES is a worldwide knowledge sharing network focused on building sustainable resilience, supporting resilience to natural and human-caused disasters, and promoting human security. And I forgot to switch, but there is TIDES. What is TIDES? So I did have to write it down, but it's right there on the slide. I just forgot to switch. TIDES is one of an activity of George Mason Center for Resilient and Sustainable Communities. It was established in 2007 at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., and moved to George Mason in 2017. I want to, before we get started with Aaron and Mei Lin, I'd like to encourage you to attend our upcoming TIDES 15th Annual Capabilities Demo. And we'd love to have more exhibitors and sponsors as well. It will be held April 18th through 20th at George Mason University and April 21st and 22nd at the Pentagon Center Court. We're going to have an outstanding list of speakers kicked off by Vince Cerf, and we'll include Ed Maybach and several other speakers who will be they will be very engaging and really interesting. Plus, you'll have demonstrations of technologies to support disaster relief. And you can see some pictures here from a previous TIDES at the picture on the bottom right is at George Mason University and at the top left, and it will be held on the lawn of the Merton building on the north part of campus. You'll see demonstration of technologies to support disaster relief, and this provides you with a great opportunity to engage with individuals and organizations devoted to resilience, disaster relief, and humanitarian assistance. So we'll at this point move into our fireside chat, and it will be moderated. Our speaker, as I said again, is Mei Lin Fung, director and founder of PeopleCentered Internet. And I'm sure she'll tell you more about it, but it's a nonprofit organization devoted to ensuring that the internet works for all of us to improve and enrich the lives of people all over the world. And our moderator will be Aaron Rose, who's an entrepreneur and expert in organizational transformation and founder and managing director of the international advisory firm Global Tactics. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Mei Lin and Aaron, for what I expect to be a fascinating conversation.
Great. Thank you, Kathy, for the warm introduction, and welcome to everyone. Today's call, which will go until 50 past the hour, so we'll cover a variety of areas about the importance of the internet and the role of the internet to our society, and how easily disruptions can take place. There's no shortage of stories about the role of the internet in enhancing people's lives and in the role of the internet for what we call for the common good. And then if you look at, there's an adage called saying that those who control the internet control the world. And there's some truth to that. You control information. And certainly we've got tremendous examples, sadly, of showing on how the control of information can control societies, and we're seeing some of that take place now in Ukraine. But I want to start with this conversation with Mei Lin and getting a better sense from you, Mei Lin, of what led to the creation of people-centered internet. We mentioned that Vint Cerf, one of the, known as one of the fathers of the internet, you and Vint co-founded PCI. We'd like to get a little bit more history about what led to the creation of the PCI. Would like to hear more about also your background. I mean, we can Google you, we can search online, but you've got an interesting background yourself, story of being born in Singapore and doing some undergraduate studies in Australia and eventually making your way to the United States. And you now reside here, a neighbor of mine in California, and you now reside in Palo Alto. But so I'll leave it there, kind of a broad strokes of PCI and you, and then we'll go there into specific initiatives about the organization.
Well, thank you, Aaron, and it's a pleasure to be here. I think the work of C-RASC and TIDES is extremely important, and never more so than in times like this. How did the people-centered internet come about? 2014 was the 40th anniversary of the TCP/IP specification that underlies the internet. And I happened to have helped to organize the 40th anniversary of the mother of all demos back in 2008. And Vint and I looked at each other across the room and thought, it would be really good to do the 40th anniversary of the TCP/IP spec. And I just stepped up and helped to organize it. So I hope that some of you will check it out. It was back in 2014, tcpip440.com. You'll see marvelous stories of people from all over the world telling how the internet came about to their country. And it was actually listening to all of those stories that made me realize perhaps the internet has lost its way from that original genesis. We heard stories of people who disobeyed their bosses, were total mavericks. The Moscow State University professor who didn't know if he'd be thrown into Lubyanka for connecting the Soviet Union to the internet. The stories were incredible. And what came across to me was the internet was a gift to humanity by those people. And it was fueled by friendship. And that spirit in 2014 had sadly seemed to have got lost. So after about a year of thinking about it, I went back to Vint and I said, I think we should actually do something to carry the flag for the people-centered internet. That it was people, it was an internet of the people, by the people, for the people. And we need to bring back that spirit and those principles. And he said, okay, let's do it. He just said that. That was to my utter surprise. I thought he'd send me to the Internet Society or something else, but that was it. The other reason why I felt so strongly that something needed to happen was I was one of the early pioneers of CRM, customer relationship management. So back in 1988, I was working at Intel, where I was the alpha test user for Intel's own distribution marketing system. Everything's proprietary in those days. And then I interviewed for a job with Tom Siebel at Oracle, who had said, I have this crazy idea. And lo and behold, he had actually interviewed 35 other people before he met me. And he said, this is what I want to do. I said, oh, no problem. I just did that at Intel. And so we were off to the races. And we did the first prototype CRM system inside Oracle. And eventually Tom spun out, did a first startup, and the second startup was Siebel Systems. And the rest is history. One side note is that after I left Oracle in 93 or 94, I helped to start CRM Talk. And we went from 0 to 300,000 people in a year, because that was the whole idea of business customer relationships was just taking off wildly. So that's a quick summary. Aaron, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I want to kind of jump around. As Kathy had mentioned in her introduction, the TIDES is holding its annual capabilities demonstration on the campus of George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, in the third week of April. And the theme for this year is sustainable resilience in a world of interconnected disruptions. I'd like to kind of follow that theme and kind of discuss some of the initiatives that PCI is involved in. And one of which last year, thank you to the invitation of my friend and colleague, Ted Felix, that's on the call here. My wife and I had a chance to visit Puerto Rico for the first time. And we were quite, such a beautiful place. But it was quite surprising as I was starting with the driver that picked us up at the airport to drive us out to Dorado, and then walking around the shops in Old San Juan, about the weak internet connections and really taking it for granted, the system that's there. And then even in California or up in Washington State and Seattle, where my companies are headquartered, is that through COVID, we've learned how weak our internet infrastructure is in a country like the United States. So I know that PCI is doing some work in collaboration with TIDES and C-RASC in Puerto Rico, and I'd like to give you a chance to explain more about that and really what are the lessons learned in the last 2 years, and how those lessons will be applied going forward, as hopefully we're getting into a new normal, or however we want to call it these days.
You're bringing back memories for me. I went to the ICANN conference in Puerto Rico in 2018. Matt Rantanen, who is the leader of our Native American projects, was there also. And I remember driving around Puerto Rico and he's saying, gosh, this place is hilly. Because you need line of sight for some of these internet things. And Puerto Rico is not an easy place to connect up. We had the privilege really to win a contract from the RAND Corporation under FEMA after the hurricanes to write the digital recovery plan for Puerto Rico. And we basically pitched it because who needs a digital recovery plan? We just need a health plan, need a transportation plan. But no, I walked into the chaos of the FEMA office in San Juan and said, we really should have a digital recovery plan. And Lynn Wells was part of the team that wrote the plan. And I think our engagement with Puerto Rico, so with C-RASC and TIDES, really began as we engaged with the local communities there. It became very, very clear to us that resilient communities were going to be a key part of what we were going to propose for the digital recovery of Puerto Rico. Because what's the point of getting health if it's not sustained? For sustainable operations, you need to have communities who themselves want to be resilient and sustainable. And so this idea of sustainable, resilient communities, I think, landed very well in Puerto Rico. And we've been working with them ever since, because it is really kind of disaster central down there in the Caribbean. Hurricanes, earthquakes, things are just happening. And if you're not aiming for resilience, you're just aiming for handouts. And who wants to live like that?
What are you seeing some of the challenges in different mindsets and stakeholders at the local level? And then in part of that question, I want to kind of transition also to the work that PCI is doing with what you call the Tribal Resource Center with Native Americans. Again, over the last 2 years, we've seen whether it's the McCalls in northwestern Washington or the Navajo in northeastern Arizona, we're seeing just huge gaps of poor or no internet connectivity. And so I'd like to get a sense, more about the different stakeholders, the challenges in dealing with that, and again, lessons learned going forward as it appears that there'll be some significant investment by the US government and other government agencies to improve the broadband infrastructure.
So with people-centered internet, of the people, by the people, and for the people, that really means you're not doing it to the people. And what we searched for as we engaged with communities in Puerto Rico were those who actually had an aspiration, had a vision for the future that they wanted to build. And we found that group. They're called Echa Palante. This is a group that this year will be 10 years in existence. So this is not a, we just stood up with the hurricanes. No, they had observed the migration of their children. Puerto Rico used to be over 4 million people. It's just over 3 million now. The children were leaving, and the people of Puerto Rico who cared and said, we got to make Puerto Rico a place that people can find work, that they can bring up families, that they want to stay. And so that was the right group for us. And when we engaged with them, it just happened that they had been planning a trip to Singapore, and that's where I'm from. And so it was just serendipity that I was able to actually open many doors for them. And instead of just having a tourist trip, they actually got to meet the architect of Singapore's public housing. They talked to the leaders in education. They talked to the co-CEO of Skills Future, and they got a sense of what sort of a digital economy and society might look like. And we were very clear, get a sense of it, but go back and work out what you want for Puerto Rico. And that is the way PCI works, which is, if you don't know what you want to do, bye-bye, we'll come back when you do, because we want to help you go where you want. We don't want to help you go where we want, because it's not going to last. And so it felt to us that Echa Palante, a group of 10,000 business leaders, educators, including the leaders of the 7 universities in Puerto Rico, all of this was critical mass for what Puerto Rico could be. And they had a vision. They had the vision, and they have a vision, and they're going to do it, of Puerto Rico as an enterprising island. And honestly, it resonated so much for me, and I think Lynn also, because I had grown up in an enterprising island of Singapore, and Singapore really said, it's up to us. And it was very resonant that they understood, the Echa Palante group, it's up to them. If they don't want to make it happen, it's not going to happen. And I have full confidence that they will make it happen, and we are going to do everything we can to support their journey.
John Seacrest in Seattle posted a very interesting comment that's worth looking at. You have to put a fundamental economic sustainability at the root of the community. Without a key economic engine, things evaporate. The key to that economic engine is currently based on internet communication at this point. So I guess it's one, as the world, at least I live in, is that I see too many, when I look at startup entrepreneurs, there's always a notion that if you build it, they will come. I've seen that for almost 30 years in my career, and you need an economic model behind your product or your service. I guess, where do you see are the gaps once the connectivity is done, the internet connectivity is established and is strengthened? Where do you see then as the gaps to furthering that to sustainable economic activity or education sustainability?
Well, I think that the gap really lies in the current model of venture capital today, that you can't have all startups wanting to become 1,000x and unicorns. You have to have ordinary people able to pursue, oh, no, I want to have a food stand. I want to grow organic vegetables. I want to do a better avocado. Ordinary people doing ordinary things are facing a problem today, which is that as the world goes digital, large companies can raise money based on their digital assets. If you look at the the stock exchange, the top 5 valuations, 85% of their value is intangible assets. Only 15% is tangible assets. But for small businesses, they can't borrow except on tangible assets. And as the world gets increasingly digital, if we don't have ways to count and track digital assets for small businesses and small enterprises, they won't get access to the working capital, to the startup capital, which is sometimes very small. It's not that they need to have a plan to become the next McDonald's. They just want to do something locally. And we need to make sure that there is local funds for that. And so we within People-Centered Internet are actually working on micro, small, medium enterprise financing with the concept of a digital utility to hold the digital assets of small businesses so that in fact the funding for these small businesses can be enabled in a way that currently is not. We are very gratified that the Bank of England has independently come up with the same idea, and it's called Open Data for SME Financing, and they published that paper back in March 2020. It's an idea whose time has come. And so with working with Puerto Rico, the enterprising island, we are seeing really startup ecosystems around the 7 university campuses and then spreading out from there. But with access to business literacy and working with each other to become better operators of businesses. And as better operators, they become more eligible for financing in the ways that their data justifies.
I remember I was given advice long ago that no matter what a business should be doing, or just the problem that they're trying to solve for their customers, is that they need to be looking at, generating recurring revenue and have something other than a zero in the retained earnings on their balance sheet and their P&L. And so I'm always, you remind me of that simple but good advice I was given. I had a pleasure a number of years ago through the Telecommunications Union, ITU, which is the body of the Geneva base at the United Nations, of this working group was charged with creating universal standards of 5G. This was the early days of 5G, standard setting, And as anyone who's traveled anywhere, 4G takes on a different meaning if you're in the United States or in China or Japan or Korea or in Saudi Arabia, and what, the stakeholders, the companies like Huawei and AT&T and Cisco and Telefonica, they saw value in creating one standard of 5G. And we were able to do that. And that was 7 years ago. And now as 5G, and it's still early stages, despite the buzz around 6G, we're at the very early stages of 5G. But we're starting to see still some cohesiveness. But the question this is the preface to a question I want to raise to you. You and I've talked privately about this, is the de-Westernization of the internet. And I'd like to get of your sense is that we are seeing a bifurcation of standards as China seems to be taking on their role of the internet, and the United States, and I would call it its allies, are seeing that. What's been your observation? And where does your concerns lie with the splitting of standards, or is this something that doesn't concern you or PCI?
I think that standards have a very important place because, of course, without TCP/IP, we wouldn't have the internet, and that was an open standard that allowed the spreading of messaging. And look at all the layers that have been put on it that now today enable e-commerce, enable us to keep on going, even though we're at home, but the world actually has kept on rolling along. So I'm a great believer in standards. In fact, I'm working on the GovStack, which is the future digital building blocks for government digital services. So definitely believer in standards. However, when you put it the way you did with, is it going to be the westernization of the world that's going to occur? Well, not so much. You know, I have to say I'm reminded of the British East India Company many years ago went and decided that they could actually do trading. And they went to a lot of countries and said, we can buy your stuff at more than you can get. And it just began with that. But in the end, Britain came up with the empire upon which the sun never set. And so I think that if we take technology and we say it needs to, you know, abide by Western attitudes and perspectives and how we live, I think you really run the danger of tech colonization. Not everybody wants to live like we do in Silicon Valley. We actually have to respect that people want to speak their own language and not English. And that, you know, this communication, humans being able to communicate with each other, no one has a monopoly on that. We should allow people to communicate in the ways they want to about the things that they want to. And so I know it's not familiar if, you know, I've lived in the West for 4 decades now, but I grew up in Singapore. It's a different culture, but it has its own things, you know. And for me, the wonder of the world is that all the cultures can learn and coexist. What communication allows us to do is exchange on the parts that we want to exchange on and not on the other parts. So I think standards will prevail, but standards which impose one culture on another, I'm not for that.
I know that through your leadership and in conjunction with Vince Cerf, you host the digital cooperation and diplomacy meetings every month, and I know that there's always, you know, some great platforms and solutions being presented during those calls. And I know Vince Cerf always asks, you know, about how does this incorporate in the standardization and the parameters that are set forth. So I appreciate what you've said. Turn more into emerging developing markets and kind of the split of standards that we're seeing and how this impacts the general population. As many people know on this call, I've done a lot of work in Africa in developing the knowledge economy and digital economy through ICT. And now we're seeing as countries have in the last 10 plus years have created their own standards and policies, not so much technical standards, but economic policies. And you're seeing, you know, tariffs on WhatsApp messages in some East African countries. And you're seeing other countries, you know, deploying systems that is allowing for surveillance. You know, where do you and PCI get involved in really the you know, on the ground level of policy making and policy advising, if at all?
Well, it would be quite audacious of us to aspire to that, but we seem to actually have drifted into it. So I'll give a little bit of the story. The UN set up the Digital Cooperation High-Level Panel in 2018. The idea of digital cooperation was to find a way in which the countries of the world, all 193 members of the United Nations, could digitally cooperate without imposing sort of cultural norms. I'll just say it that way. But are there ways in which we can exchange information without requiring it be done in a specific way according to one dominant culture? And so this idea of digital cooperation had 20 members, and Vince Cerf was one of them, but it was actually very diverse, of all ages, people from many countries. It was chaired by Melinda Gates and Jack Ma. So even the chairmanship was actually quite diverse. And they came up with essentially the notion that there are common digital public goods that we need to start to think about. And these digital public goods are actually quite new for us, the humanity, all of us, because we've allowed for-profit companies to kind of define, here's your tech, this is what it is. And for-profit companies are not in the business of creating digital public goods. So you don't have much familiarity with the idea of digital public goods. But think about electricity, think about water. These are all things that are possible for everybody to access because some people invested in, electricity transmitters, the whole wonderful story of the Tennessee Valley Authority and cooperatives in the Midwest bringing electricity in. It's taken humans to work out how to bring it out. So what I see is that we're in the middle of that transition. What do we as humans want to do to take the ideas of digital cooperation and digital public goods and work out how to coexist? But that's why we call it digital cooperation and diplomacy, because I have a vision of the internet just like the ocean. The ocean is a shared public good that all the people of the earth participate in and enjoy. But it was only in 1982 that the United Nations set up the UN Law of the Sea conference to kind of work out, okay, when you meet, how are you going to cross? How do you operate in this common good, the ocean? And we still have not yet done that for digital. So we actually need to work out some of these things. And it's only been 20 or 30 years. The amount of change we've seen in our lifetime is astounding due to the internet. And so we shouldn't be surprised if our children and our children's children actually see a very different internet. David Bray, who used to be executive director for PCI, had a wonderful way to describe this. Some of you may be familiar with IPv4 and IPv6, which is the Internet Protocol version 4, which was the former one. And the current one is Internet Protocol version 6. And this gives many, many more addresses than IPv4. So if you take IPv4, all those addresses, and you mush them into something the size of a beach ball, say like this, how big of a ball would the IPv6 addresses be mushed into at that same density? I want some guesses.
Boy, that's the short answer is I don't know. That's a great question. If anyone here, I mean, we got a small group, unmute yourself. Feel free to
John
ask a question.
Seacrest says size of the planet.
Size of the planet. That's a good answer, John.
Anyone else? Anyone else? It's the sun. Lynn Wells is right. It's the size of the
Oh,
sun. So how can we expect that our intuition about how things could work that have been developed in something the size of a beach ball take us all the way to something the size of the sun? It can't. By the way, 93 million miles, right?
absolutely. One astronomical unit.
Well,
I
actually, that's
remember.
not quite true. That's from Earth to the sun. The sun
Oh, is
is
that Earth to the
smaller
sun?
than that. Yeah.
Okay. Um, where I want to return to the question of the different stakeholders, and particularly whether it's in the United States or international outside the U.S., the deployment of internet and you say the common good. I reminded again, I grew up in Colorado. Certainly, water rights was a huge issue, back in the mining industry. But it wasn't until 1997 when I moved to Seattle. And I realized, how contentious the common good of rivers are, and both with the farmers and the and power. And then in California, when I made the move to California a few years ago, again, whether you're Southern or Northern California, and some of the real, heated battles when it comes to water, but it is the notion of the common good, and applying that to the internet. I know, again, a story with Seattle. The city of Seattle owns Seattle City Light. The power company is owned by the citizens of its people, and other districts and municipalities have that as well. And then there were initiatives about deploying the internet. And of course, anything involving technology involves significant, not just deployment, but then significant investments in maintenance. And the question is it feasible or not feasible? So I want to lay that out because I know the PCI, and I think one of the more recent newsletters talked about in the Commonwealth of Virginia, the Commonwealth Connect Virginia broadband resource. And I just want to get a sense from you and how you see, again, whether it's the city of Kampala, Munich, whatever it may be, of who, is it the government and public good to deploy and monitor the access to the internet and use of in that sense, or power companies, right? Controlled, and telephone companies control the telephones, the landlines back in the day. So, where do you see is the roles and responsibilities going forward as we still have so many, over billions of people not connected to the internet?
So power is a really electricity, energy, electrical power is a very good analogy in my mind. Remember, before there were big electrical generation plants or hydroelectricity or these big, massive electrical power, if you wanted electricity, you had to buy a generator. And so only wealthy people could afford a generator, and then poor people, well, candles or kerosene lamps. And I actually, that was actually quite familiar for me in growing up in Singapore. Many people just had kerosene lamps. That was what they did, So in California, PG&E, a private company, I know their problems, provides electricity. So there are many different ways in which you can provide electricity, but they are a utility that is regulatory oversight. So whether it's private, like PG&E, or public, like Seattle City owning it, that there are regulations for utilities. Utilities offer public goods, because we can't have somebody saying, I own the Colorado River and you have to pay me if you want to get water, because them's fighting words. You can't do that. And it's because it's so precious. And I think we're going to get to that stage with the internet where we realize it is a public good, that people should have the right to communicate to others. They can decide not to use that right, just like they can decide not to use the water. but they should have the right. So that's where I'm coming from. But having the right doesn't mean you have to have a bulky, inefficient, incompetent government utility doing it for you. I want to see market competition about the best, cheapest, most affordable, high quality internet access for as many people as possible. And let the competition begin about how to create those electrical plants, that equivalents for the internet, whether it's satellite or so on.
I had, going back to Puerto Rico and the interconnectedness, I had wrote a blog post when I was in Puerto Rico last year, and thanks to Lynn Wells, was introduced to a gentleman in San Juan. Unfortunately, our schedules didn't allow for an in-person gathering, but we've been able to maintain a virtual relationship and talking about, places like, Puerto Rico and other areas, of the world that have challenges of connectivity. And I had certainly no surprise, and I'm not the only one that had this, kind of vision of going forward, but satellite connectivity through like Starlink is making the internet more accessible and hopefully will then drive down costs. Where, Mei Lin, does satellite connectivity, where do you see the role of that? I know there's been talk about it for decades, literally, about satellite connectivity, both in television and now the internet, and it really hasn't materialized on the broad scale that people had predicted. But is the technology changing enough, and will it improve connectivity and accessibility through satellite?
It will eventually improve. It'll become more affordable to have satellite communication. But I want to talk about the key word that you mentioned, which is cost. Why did electricity become affordable? It's because once you have electricity, then you have an ongoing stream of revenue from every household. Today, we're not thinking about the internet that way. So we can't do the investment. A single startup can't do the investment to set up internet connectivity for a town of 20,000 because people aren't sure if that startup will continue to exist. And so it can't raise the money. But if it was a utility, the utility providing internet to 20,000 people, whether it's 20,000 households, monthly revenue of X, you can raise money on that. So I think we have not explored the financial business models that could allow affordable internet. And the story of electricity is exactly the same as this. That's why they had those Midwest cooperatives, so that they could assure the constant stream of monthly revenues, which allowed the cooperative to raise the money to set up the electrical generating plants. So it's a business model issue that we have somehow got blinkers on because we say, oh, it has to be a startup. Well, the trouble with a startup is you don't know if the startup's going to last, if it's going to be competently managed, and whether or not it will do it. But if you actually have some level of oversight that that entity is going to get the revenue from the internet connectivity fees from all the households around, then you can raise the money.
That's a good point. It reminds me of work I did in Haiti back in the late 2000s, and I used to give seminars to entrepreneurs. And I thought before my first class, these were typical startups, and many of my students were actually running small businesses in Haiti. Some of these businesses had 12 employees, which is significant, but they were too big to get capital from microfinance institutions and too small to get it from the traditional lenders, those few that would lend to an enterprise in Haiti. It goes down to, how do you deal with the risks and scale? We've got 4 minutes here. Certainly want to invite anyone else to put in their questions before we do concluding remarks. And I'll have one announcement to make about the next event. But is there anyone that wants to put a question in? I know Kathy makes the point about thinking how to, make online news affordable. This week's Economist has a editorial really criticizing the tech companies for actually pulling out of Russia, and saying that when Google and Apple made those decisions to shut down, that they essentially have ceding over the channels of information to the government, to Putin's regime. And I thought it was interesting. I mean, it was, just something to think about. But I guess with that said, Mei Lin, not to get you to make any political comments, but when you look at connectivity with what's taking place and with refugees in general, I mean, we've got Ukraine on the news now, but we still have refugees coming out of Afghanistan. We still have them in Africa, North Africa. But what are you mindful of and going forward that we should be mindful of on this call when it comes to the work that you're doing and the mission you're trying to achieve?
I'd like you all to be mindful of the unintended sort of blinkers we place on ourselves, thinking things have to work in a particular way. Refugees can work, can earn money, can socialize, can do things, can access telemedicine. There are ways in which we can not do it the old way, but think about new ways. And so I'll just leave 2 words for you: digital economics. That we are not looking at the economics of digital footprints and how digital enables activities to happen and the costs of doing it digitally versus physically. There are ways in which we can have the combination work, but we're seeing it all online or all physical, but the combination could be the magic to helping us come out of this, not just for the refugees, but for all kinds of disasters. Because the big issue for disasters, what can you do to prevent? What can you do to prepare? Well, with digital and the internet, we can do a lot more to prevent and prepare, but we're not coordinated. We're not talking to each other. Okay, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. We are at our end of our time. Definitely want to thank you, Mei Lin, for your great insights. And you mentioned the name David Bray. David and Eric Rasmussen were our first speakers. I think what you provided really followed well in our second Starside's Fireside chat. Our third one will take place on Monday, April 11th at 4 o'clock Eastern Time with John Francis, Zen and the Art of Environmental Protection. We hope you're able to join us at that time. As a reminder, we do have the StarTides capabilities demo in Washington, D.C., in Fairfax, Virginia, April 18th. I will be in Northern Virginia for that event. I hope to see those of you in person, see those of you on this call, maybe in person at that time. I want to thank everyone for your time. Wishing you all a great day, and we'll be in touch. Thank you. Goodbye.